Good afternoon, everyone. I'm always taller than this allows, so let me just give me 1 second to adjust. Thank you. That's much easier. Yeah, that's much better. Thank you. I've just come off a red eye from New York, so if I'm not making sense, please stop me and let me know. But it's very good to be here. I'm honored to address you this afternoon, and I thank the Academy for Cultural Diplomacy for inviting me to speak. My name is Kholood Khair, and I'm the founder and director of Confluence Advisory, as you just heard. And I'm delighted to be here as this event is a great opportunity to speak about the relationship between Africa and the United Kingdom through the lens of cultural diplomacy. And I'm pleased to have these few minutes to signpost a few key challenges as well as the opportunities available. As we find ourselves in now sunny London, I will focus my remarks on what the UK can do to improve its relationships with African states and African people rather than the opposite. And this is a particularly opportune moment in the UK politics for a discussion on a reset, especially as the House of Lords Select Committee on International Relations and Defence recently noted, successive UK governments have promised to prioritise engagement with Africa and none have, so far at least. The Sunak government, for example, had planned for a UK-Africa investment summit in April of this year that was indefinitely postponed, seemingly without reason, simply deprioritised. The new Labour government has promised to update their Africa strategy, and investing in this would be a significant way for Labour to break with the previous government's poor track record of maintaining UK-Africa ties. At the outset, I should say, it's always difficult to speak about Africa in limited terms, say in the confines of a 15 or 20-minute speech. It is a continent with 54 different countries and thousands of languages and cultures, and cannot be essentialized into a few analytical or cultural tropes. Nevertheless, the continent as a political milieu is a place of shared interests and does have noteworthy trends that are central to the discussion in a forum such as this. Africa is the world's youngest continent and has the world's highest birth rate, meaning that it will continue to have the world's youngest population for some time. By 2050, it is calculated that Africa's population will grow by almost 100% to 2 billion people and will have the world's largest working age population. This is a huge opportunity for the continent and its global partners to realize some of the continent's long-awaited political and economic transformations. The African Union, in response to these demographic shifts, has prioritized job creation and the economy in its Agenda 2063. But it has a very long way to go to get there. The UK, which has seen its imports to Africa shrink, would do well to align some of its economic targets with this agenda and bolster engagement there. But while much has been made of the UK's investment potential in Africa, Africa's potential as a major partner goes beyond trade and requires a reframing and a resetting of the UK's relationship with Africa, both its people and its states. This reset has to be based on common interests, yes, but also shared values. Historically, sharing values has meant that African people and states had to share the values of the UK. Such values, of course, are rarely shared, merely imposed. Sharing values actually means engaging in dynamic discourses on key topics, both domestic and international, and especially when those two intersect. One such issue is the current televised atrocities taking place, for example, in Palestine. African countries have historically been almost unanimous about their position for the need for Palestinian liberation and the end of Israel's occupation and apartheid. This is a position now largely echoed by the International Court of Justice. The UK's position under the last government wanted few friends on this issue in the African continent, but the new government in Whitehall can start reversing this, at the very least by stopping arms transfers that go towards the incessant bombing of children. There was also a recent missed opportunity to reset UK-Africa relations and bring them firmly into the 21st century. The visit of King Charles to Kenya would have been much more impactful had the king been given leave to formally apologise for Britain's violent quelling of the Mau Mau revolt against British colonial rule in the 1950s. The lack of political recompense, never mind the financial compensation due to survivors and their families, invariably means that part of the UK-Kenyan relations will always be stuck in the past, alongside that unresolved historical injustice. As far as global structures are concerned, the inclusion of the African Union in the G20 is an important step towards global representation, but a permanent seat for Africa at the UN Security Council is still pending. Though significant, such developments overwhelmingly favor African states rather than necessarily their people. This will require perhaps some of the biggest departure from the previous government, particularly when it comes to migration frameworks, with recent reporting that foreign student numbers have declined this year by 63% due to unissued visas. The UK's ability to engage some of Africa's future leaders in politics, the arts, business, technology, and society will be largely hampered. Education is perhaps the UK's most desirable offering for a growing young population in Africa, but African applicants are twice as likely to be refused a visa to the UK than applicants from elsewhere, despite costing the highest fees and having the longest processing times. Alongside shared values come shared interests. Though the British International Investment Instrument, or BII, aims to invest around $8 billion a year in Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean, overall, UK investment in Africa has been sharply declining from a high of $43 billion in 2012 to around a third of that by the start of this decade. While African GDP has grown more than 20% in the past decade, UK imports and exports as a percentage of total trade to Africa have halved during the same period. Further, with Brexit supercharging the crisis in global multilateralism, the UK is now left with far less money for aid and no ability to rely on the EU Commission's joint funding for development and infrastructure projects around Africa. So how should the UK reset its engagement with the African continent? Firstly, the UK should not be afraid of global economic competition, but rather rise to the occasion. It's true that the UK is no longer a top 3 trading partner with any African country, supplanted by China, India, and the United Arab Emirates. It's also true that Russia and China's trade and security engagement is tied up with efforts to undermine the current international order. But with so many signs that that international order did not work well for everyone, is it any wonder that despite the avaricious interests and bad deals, African states are still encouraged by the option of having Chinese and Russian investment? By building shared values and shared political investments, the UK can spearhead changes to the international order that rebuild it on a more solid and shared foundation than before. A 2021 government review indicated that the then UK government was more inclined to prize geopolitical competition over a previous emphasis on global cooperation. This saw that government choosing a focus on climate change over the previous UK priority of poverty reduction, as if the two issues aren't inherently linked. Global interests such as these must be aligned. Conversely, diplomacy, defense, and aid must be de-linked. The UK must increase its diplomatic footprint in Africa and seek partners, not allies. It must reinstate the 0.7% of gross national income target for aid. The cuts we have witnessed from 1.7 billion to 766 million in Africa would have been unthinkable a decade ago. Such was the importance of aid and combating poverty to the UK's global identity. The UK must also invest in consistent and sustainable commitments, financial and political, that outlast changing governments and cabinet reshuffles, especially after years of rapid turnover on the Africa file at the FCDO, and come up with workable strategies to mitigate the damage caused by the FCO and DFID merger. Secondly, the UK should aim to forge a new course and expand this relationship across more of the continent, beyond the well-established relationships it has with countries such as Egypt, Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa, or its influence will be outpaced by global powers, as well as emerging middle powers, particularly in the Arabian Gulf. The current global trends influencing new generations of Africans emanate from countries that have a contempt for democracy, all while young Africans continue to push against many barriers to define what democracy means for them. Consequently, Africa has seen a pendulum swing towards autocracy and political and economic models that favor autocrats. The UK should support Africa's overwhelming young populations in their struggle to mitigate the democratic reversals seen in some African contexts. With ever younger demographies across the continent, no doubt we will see the youth-led political movements such as those in Sudan, Nigeria, Kenya, and Senegal continue. And in such movements is the greatest hope that autocratic trends could be reversed. To support this, I must stress again that the UK government must reframe its foreign policy on Africa and elsewhere from a state-based relationship to a people and state-based relationship. Further, the UK must rethink the lens through which it views Africa, from one which reflects mostly poverty, terrorism, a threatening youth bulge that would lead, as some perceive it, to unfettered migration, to one where investing in the democratic aspirations of Africa's people would create the necessary conditions for regional stability and prosperity. Thirdly, the UK should work to future-proof its engagement with Africa and Africans. To do this, the UK must find areas of synergy, for example, on combating climate change, as Africans will feel the effects and impacts of climate change more than perhaps any other population on Earth, and where the prospects for green energy are many. Other such areas as education, science and technology, fashion and the arts, amongst others, also offer ways to increase future sustained engagements and cultural exchange. To enable this, the UK must urgently review its visa regime and minimize the expense, humiliation, and low success rate currently experienced by many African visa seekers. Simultaneously, a comprehensive review of trade and investment policies is urgently needed that would, for example, look at increasing the congruities between BII, the investment instrument, and the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. Lastly, and perhaps one of the most crucial in light of current events, the UK government must invest far more in diaspora engagement. To do this, it must first ask itself, how can the UK rebuild its relationships with Africans when it cannot adequately protect African diaspora here in the UK? The protests over the past months have shown the uglier side of unrestrained, state-sponsored hate speech against minorities. It may have come at an inconvenient time for the new Labour government, but how this government responds to this will decide to a great deal how the UK will be seen, not just by Africans, but by the entire world. At the height of the riots, I had friends whose families are currently under Israeli bombardment get in touch to ask how my family and I were doing with the targeted attacks on minorities in the UK, particularly on Muslims and people of color. If nothing else, these riots show how interconnected the previous government's failures are, with austerity here in the UK correlated to poor foreign investment and slashes to the aid budget, from destroying shared interests at home through divisive policies, as well as contributing to undermining faith in global order and solidarity abroad. And not forgetting the buying into narrow, populist rhetoric here in the UK, the highest levels of government, rather than celebrating international diversity and global opportunities. Migration has been a sustained policy pillar here in the UK and indeed much of Europe since at least the 2008 financial crash. European history tells us that European governments have not tended to do well to mitigate domestic financial strife and often deflect responsibility by finding marginalized groups to pin the blame on. And who are more marginalized than migrants, whose precarity, itself a product of statecraft, is cravenly used to scapegoat them? It's a remarkably successful, if abominable, policy, and it is proven to be a deadly one. Let's look at this differently for a moment. What if I told you that according to the Office of National Statistics, only 1.5 million people in the entire African diaspora live in the UK, making up about 2% of the UK population, while around 2 to 2.5 million Britons live in Africa? Would you expect those Britons to have similar experiences to Africans here in the UK? I doubt that. Globalized power dynamics are indeed a reality. Nevertheless, though few Britons would ever face the type of organized hostility from African mobs or indeed government officials, here in the UK, the Windrush scandal, the hostile environment, and the Black Lives Matter protests all telegraph very clearly that the UK has neither adequately reckoned with its history, with the global African diaspora, nor invested sufficiently in dismantling racist structures and policies here at home. Before I end, I want to draw your attention to a specific case study. For nowhere in the past 18 months is the UK's faltering policy in Africa more apparent than in Sudan, my home country, and the country where in 2018, jubilation at the overthrow of a 30-year dictatorship soon gave way to a coup in 2021, and 18 months later, a devastating all-out war. The UK, an erstwhile strong global leader in peacemaking, as well as famine prevention and humanitarian aid, squandered several diplomatic opportunities to adequately respond to political developments as they unfolded. After the military coup, cuts to embassy staffing and the government's combining of defense, aid, and foreign policy meant that the defense attaché's role was shared with the embassy in Egypt, a far more important post, and the role moved to Cairo. With the capacities of this role diminished, an over-reliance on the US to lead the way, despite the UK's own long-standing relationship with Sudanese, meant, as I told Parliamentary Select Committee last year, that the UK's embassy leadership was unable to spot the signs of discontent even amongst its key interlocutors. And the senior and were deaf to the drums of war. As a result, the ambassador, the deputy ambassador, and the senior security manager were all on leave when the war started in April 2023. Successive cuts to foreign aid programming has minimized relationships between Sudanese civil society and the UK, with the UK overly relying on its relationships with vested and myopic political elites. Today, Sudan is the world's largest humanitarian disaster, has the world's largest displaced population, and the world's largest magnitude food insecurity crisis, and the world's first famine in almost a decade, declared there earlier this month. The UK's response thus far has been to withdraw the role of an envoy for Sudan during one of the country's bleakest points and to close the door for calls for family reunification pathways or asylum for Sudanese fleeing this shattering war, the kind of pathways that exist for Ukrainians fleeing theirs. The new UK government needs to more seriously respond to one of Africa's biggest wars today. This means, first and foremost, urgently appointing a dedicated UK envoy for Sudan and promptly instituting sustainable and safe pathways for asylum, and the UK embassy, relocated to Addis Ababa, to urgently re-engage with a broad spectrum of civil society representing many views, not merely engaging those conveniently positioned political elites. Doing so allows the UK, through robust programming, a chance to champion the voices of a broad range of civic actors who, despite their precarity post-displacement, are fighting to coalesce around an inclusive, peaceful agenda. At the UN, the UK must use its penholder status on Sudan, more concertedly push for greater Security Council focus on the impacts of the war and to work to marshal support amongst member states in surging the famine response. Closer to home, the government should set up a diaspora engagement platform that would inform the government's engagement on Sudan's unfolding crisis and support Sudanese in the UK to cope with the fallout of this war. Further and more broadly, it must do everything it can to protect Sudanese and others who would be targets for racially aggravated attacks in the UK. This new government has a chance to prioritize partnerships with Africans as equals, to undo the legacy of 14 years of deprioritization and missed opportunities, to invest not only financially but socially in Africa again, to demonstrate an ability to reckon with its past offenses with African nations and people, and to marshal the strength of Africa's diaspora across the UK to better partner with Africa's people, not just its leaders, and reset and co-create shared values and priorities around peace and prosperity. The time for that reset is now. Thank you.